two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Jay Lambrix. Both Jay and I are members of the Ithaca DSA Housing Policy Committee. Almost everybody knows about the many problems with housing in the Ithaca area. High rents, homelessness, people forced to commute long distances to work in Ithaca, putting emissions into the air from their cars. So our committee works on many of the problems. We work on stabilization, keeping people in their homes. For instance, we cooperate with the Ithaca Tenants Union to promote the REST Act. REST stands for Rent Emergency Stabilization for Tenants Act. We take on zoning to eliminate provisions in city zoning that get in the way of building more housing for working people. We analyze how tax abatements for upscale buildings have distorted the housing market. We have heard about the increased danger of serious flooding, which also adds to costs through insurance. And we're looking at how this affects everything else. The really big problem is supply of housing affordable to the people who work in the city of Ithaca, and, for that matter, analogous smaller problems in all the other nodes of development around the county. That is where we turn our attention today. You can't rely on the fictitious magic of markets. People who have lots of money to invest want to make big profits, so they build expensive housing. So, Jay, could the city of Ithaca build housing, the housing that's needed?
Well, Teresa, unfortunately, no. The city of Ithaca, with its tax base being severely eroded by tax-exempt Cornell, can't even afford to clear snow and ice from the streets, let alone build housing. The federal government has money, but politically, it's useless. The money goes to the military and outer space, unfortunately, whether Republican or Democrats rule. Well, how about New York State? With a population of nearly 20 million, it is larger than many small countries. It has the power to collect income tax, and income taxes are much fairer than the property taxes or sales taxes that local governments can collect. In fact, New York State has the power to decide what kinds of taxes it wants to.
Yes, and a couple of years ago, there was a big push to increase. It was DSAers in New York, especially in New York City, referred to it as tax the rich. Um, I think it later on, when they went into coalitions, it was invest in our New York. But it proposed a number of different kinds of taxes that would enable the city to tax the very rich and do what is needed for everybody. As far as housing goes, building housing, for more than a year, there's been a bill before the New York State Legislature called the Permanently Affordable Housing for New Yorkers Act. It's more snappily called Green Social Housing. This may sound familiar. The inquiring socialist talked about this a year ago. So, what does the Permanently Affordable Housing for New Yorkers bill call for?
Well, first of all, it establishes an authority. And what is that, you may ask? The state has numerous such authorities. There are the Port of New York Authority, the Thruway Authority, the Dormitory Authority, and many others such as those. You may have taken a bus to the Port Authority bus terminal in Manhattan already, and the buses may be privately owned, but the terminal itself is public property. Authorities can issue tax-exempt bonds to pay for what they build. So the Social Housing Development Authority will get some significant tax money. $60 million to set up and staff the authority. It then can then issue bonds to build housing or to buy existing housing and repair it, or to help tenant organizations buy the buildings they live in to run them as co-ops. And then it specifies in great detail how the building or rehabilitation of the housing must be done by union labor. It also specifies in great detail how the resulting buildings must meet environmental standards.
So, to step back a little bit, how has this problem of the need for more housing been addressed in the past in New York State?
How has it been addressed? Well, we are aware of the many homeless people in Ithaca. Clearly, there is not enough housing. Also, we are aware of an estimated 15,000 who live outside of Tompkins County and commute into work. And there are more who live in rural areas of Tompkins County but commute to the city of Ithaca. That's a lot of energy, a lot of exhaust fumes and fuel being burnt. It's also a lot of money. And that's not the only problem in Ithaca, but also in New York City. Other places have more housing, but it is in bad condition.
Yeah, and I was saying, how has the problem been addressed in the past? Well, American attempts to produce affordable housing since the 1980s have been based on the belief that government can't do anything well. This ideology says that only the private sector can be effective. So instead of building needed public housing, the federal government in particular encouraged and encourages privately financed housing by giving tax credits to the private developers. Now, there's a big problem with those tax credits. They only require the housing to stay affordable for about 30 years. I think it varies a little from case to case. Uh, and at the end of those 30 years, whoever owns the building is free to evict the tenants and raise the rents and perhaps for the first time in years refurbish the buildings. So we should also take a look not just at what America has done or failed to do, but also what other countries do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And numerous other countries use uh, a more fair, progressive system of taxation, which is collected, according to the ability to pay to build housing. And my favorite example being the city of Vienna in Austria. Vienna is world famous for its pioneering and beautiful public housing, equipped with play areas, nursery schools, swimming pools, and even statutory building codes that ensure high standards. This housing stock is competitive with the private sector. They build it to attract people of many different income backgrounds, and it is built to be quality and not just to meet the basic minimum. So buildings built 100 years ago are still happily being lived in today and are still in very good shape. And Ithaca DSA has made a couple of video interviews actually with Red Vienna. They are online at ithacadsa.org if you want to learn more about this case study.
Actually, I think, uh, well, maybe at ithacadsa.org, um, but for sure on YouTube,
Mm.
where Ithaca DSA has a channel. Yeah, and that, by the way, is in a sense my heritage. Not that my ancestors actually lived in the public housing, but They lived in Vienna. They were socialists. There's a family legend that on May Day, my aunt, who was tall and good looking, marched around the ring, the round street around the central part of Vienna in the May Day parade, wearing a red bathing suit and shouting, "Only Red Vienna builds swimming pools."
And a lot of people would say, like, yeah, Vienna's great, but it's Europe. So can we point to anything in New York State's past that would that from which we could draw inspiration?
Yes, New York State had the Mitchell-Lama Act passed in 1955. It gave partial state financing to housing projects. A well-known one is Co-op City in the Bronx, a huge high-rise development with about 50,000 residents. In other words, more residents in Co-op City than in the city of Ithaca.
Mm.
Uh, and Co-op City was built with union financing as well as Mitchell-Lama financing, and it is still a co-op today. There are numerous other Mitchell-Lama buildings around the city, but alas, many have been privatized,
Mm.
and the state has simply not been funding Mitchell-Lama in recent years.
That's unfortunate. Has it been replaced in any way?
Well, it could be replaced. I mean, this has not happened yet, but there is a new bill in both houses of the state legislature. I think we referred to it before. It's called the Permanently Affordable Social Housing for New Yorkers Act. Um, at this point, it is Senate Bill 5674. It had a different number last year. And Assembly Bill 6265.
Mm.
The sponsors are in the Assembly Emily Gallagher, who is, I think, the author. Undoubtedly, her legislative staffer is the author, but she's the Assembly person. She's also a DSAer. And in the Senate, introduced by Cordell Clear. But I think if anyone wants to look it up, search for permanently affordable social housing for New Yorkers. And that should find you the bill online.
Sounds sounds great. Would you like to get into the intimate details of the bill, or would you like to discuss what's missing currently in the current iteration?
I looked at it, fairly extensively and only found one thing that I felt was missing. And okay, to lead into that, there are detailed provisions that if residents have a problem with with the authority or the people who are running the buildings, there are lots of provisions in detail about how they can take action
Mm.
and get good results. But I did not see any provision to deal with situations where there are complaints by one tenant against another tenant.
Uh,
And
yeah,
yeah, this is serious. I've heard of
right. Yeah,
cooperative,
it's not just tenants versus landlords.
yeah, cooperative housing destroyed by this kind of dispute. Um,
Mm.
By the way, there's a cute example of tenant on tenant disputes comes up in the theme song to the program Crazy Words, Crazy Tune on the same radio station,
Uh,
WRFI,
mm,
uh, about a tenant. Uh, the singer talks about a tenant who plays the ukulele till 3:30 in the morning and sings.
mm.
And the singer says they will someday they'll kill this guy.
Yeah, I had a friend who sweetest person you can imagine, but she had um a major dispute going on with her with the tenants that were living right next door to her, and
Oh,
it got to the point where like she felt like she was in danger, but there's very limited recourse for situations like
yeah.
those.
Yeah, well,
And
for
yeah,
that,
that's a big blind spot in the bill. I'd have
yeah,
to say.
I remember living with tenants across the hall that this was decades ago. Disco music all the time, but we just put on our own music.
Hey,
That worked.
yeah, and I mean, like that's on the lower end of the many many problems
Yeah.
that can crop up. But I mean, yeah, but
Well,
yeah, even things like that, if there's no recourse, then people are not going to want to stay in any properties that the government may or not build.
w
It's
well, I mean, for
be a lot of
instance,
turnover.
what can be done? Um, I hear that in Vienna there are employees dedicated to resolving disputes between neighbors.
Mm, that that's very smart.
Yeah.
I like that. All right. So okay. So now we've heard about, the some of the shortcomings and some of the positive provisions, but who can we expect to support us when it comes to this bill?
Well, we don't quite know yet. I think we are going to be talking to our own representatives in the state legislature. Anna Kellis, our
Mm,
assembly member, and Leah Webb, our state senator. They have not yet signed on to this bill, as far as I know. And I have
mm,
to always say that because there is sometimes a lag between when
mm.
a member co-sponsors something and when it gets into the online documentation.
Yeah,
So
that's fair.
we can't swear that they haven't. We believe they haven't yet.
Mm,
Uh, there are there are activists from New York City DSA
mm,
working on this in New York City. We are reaching out to them. We're
mm.
attending some of their meetings. There are some others around the state. I think you were able to better attend some of the statewide things.
Yes.
So I think, we're going to get support from DSA people around the state as well, and probably some
Mm.
people who aren't in DSA.
Yeah, yeah, like I talk to people who are very much, into this whole, abundance agenda, meaning, like you just need to build more private housing, just need to build new private housing and, everything will be resolved that way. And, the way I like to, approach, those people who think that way is I say, yeah, like that's fine, but you know what we need? We need, competition. We need real competition with private developers, and that's a type of framing that I've found, really, if not in the beginning, it can kind of, start working its way into the minds of the people who, are very much supportive of the free market, but at the same time, presenting in this way that, we need actually affordable housing in order to convince private developers to actually lower their prices. prices. And unfortunately, relying on the private market just doesn't get you there. You need public housing where the government can control the costs and they can sell them or they can rent them out at cost. So they're not making a profit. And that's what's going to actually incentivize landlords and new developers who come
to
in to lower their prices in response.
to compete with that.
Exactly. Exactly. Like when a new developer comes to the market, and I know my sister is a landlord. She goes into different cities, she buys properties and she rents them out. And part of the calculus is not, oh, what's the lowest I can get away with charging? It's first of all, how much did it I spend on this house? Two, how much can I get away with charging based on the current market conditions? So it does, like, even if it doesn't increase the housing costs, it doesn't decrease them, it doesn't lower them, which is the biggest misconception that I think people have is that new housing usually will at least it will maintain the status quo at least. It will not lower prices.
Yeah, I mean that's a kind of faith in markets that
Yes.
doesn't really work out in reality.
Well, and the problem is that the housing market is very different from other markets. There's the this neoliberal concept of supply and demand. It may work for things like laptops and certain kinds of toys, but when it comes to the housing market, that's just not the case. It's a very different animal. And yeah, I mean, like even the housing experts will tell you that, but even then, there still persists this like supply and demand myth.
Yeah.
Kind of makes you wonder. It kind of makes you wonder why do they continuously perpetuate this myth that they know is not true? I think that's the key question. But
Well, I think there's a lot of money in it.
yes, a lot of money, and if it goes against that sacred narrative of supply and demand will always solve our problems, then it automatically has to be rejected.
Well, let's
But
see.
yeah,
Um,
so I'm
we
hopeful going forward.
yeah, we called it green social housing, and there are, long passages in the bill that
Mm,
make it that. I
mm,
mean, there are all sorts of specs about how it has to be environmentally uh, well done.
mhm,
Uh, there are provisions that the labor that builds it should be union labor.
mm.
In
Yeah.
other words, it should also be supporting decent jobs. And I think I mentioned before that a lot of provisions uh, in great detail about how tenants can, if they're having a problem, can go either to the manager, can have a voice in how the building is run,
Yes.
or even address the authority itself.
Yeah,
And
I totally agree, and that's something we see in places like Vienna, where if you give people a sense of ownership, even if it's in an apartment setting, that increases the likelihood that they will not only stay, but that they will also take very good care of the property. So it's a win-win.
yeah, so and I should also say that Vienna is not the only place.
Yes,
There
that is
are
true.
many other cities around the world
Mm. Yeah,
that
yeah,
have
and
good public housing.
yeah, yeah. We were.
Britain Britain was a place that had it was called council housing, and
Yes,
it was
I've heard of
good
that.
until Margaret Thatcher destroyed it.
Uh,
Well, the
yeah,
United States had some pretty decent public housing as part of the New Deal,
Mm. Yeah, they did. We were on the path to great public housing, but
Then
what
Ronald
happened?
Ronald Reagan came along.
Ronald Reagan, but even before then, though, there was this constant fear mongering about, giving nice housing to poor people. It was all about poor, poor people, don't need quality. They need just the basic, metrics for livable housing, which I mean, livable is a very, subjective term, open to interpretation, but it's all about the fear mongering. And, not only that, but they also said, we can't give good housing to low income individuals, but we also can't give housing to anyone in the middle class. So, they pit the two against each other, and it it paid off. It worked. Politicians were terrified to go any further than they had.
Yes, well, uh, thank you, Jay
Um,
Lambrix, for
my pleasure.
helping me to go into this exploration of green social housing, the Permanently Affordable Social Housing for New Yorkers Act.
Well, thank you, Teresa, for
This
presenting this. Your knowledge has, you've taught me a lot, and I I really appreciate it.
this has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.